Here, nerds, we are going to be talking about the principle of movement today. And when we talk about movement in art, it's just a little bit different than how your idea of movement in general is, okay, with an actual object moving from place to place. Art interprets it just a little bit differently and a little bit deeper. So, for starters, movement is defined as the placement of art elements. So, that's our line, shape, color, value, texture, space, and form. Okay. And it's the placement of those elements to make the viewer's eye move. Now, in short, this design principle applies movement to a non moving picture. Now, the big question we have is how can a non moving picture convey movement? Okay. This type of movement refers to how the viewer's gaze is led through the composition. So objects don't actually move. Instead, it's how they are organized to create visual pathways that guide the viewer's attention from one object or form to another. Okay, so your eyes move, not the picture. So in this image we have here, we have a yellow rectangle and a blue circle. And as you see, there's not much movement to encourage the travel of your gaze throughout this image, okay? However, if we position the exact same object differently, we can convey movement, okay? So we have this upward movement that's happening here. Even if the circle was the same color as the rectangle, so we don't have that emphasis of color going on, okay? We would follow the angle of the rectangle and follow it upwards. Here we have three different rectangles, and they're all going different directions. And what makes them different is whether or not they convey a whole lot of movement. So if we put a circle right on top of our flat horizontal rectangle, nothing much is happening, okay? It's almost like a box sitting on a table. The box isn't going anywhere. What if we had a vertical rectangle and a circle next to it? Once again, they both seem kind of stationary. But if we put a circle on top of that slanted rectangle, we have this idea that it's moving downwards, okay? We have this tension that's created by the fact that the rectangle is not flat, okay? So we have that going for it as well. Now, as I mentioned before, I talked about visual pathways, okay? In this image, we have our rectangles organized very regularly, with them gradually getting smaller and smaller as they move towards the left. The tops and bottoms of these rectangles are creating implied diagonal lines, and our gaze will follow them. Okay, so let's look at a slightly more complicated image. So we have some diagonal lines that lead our gaze across the image. I highlighted them there for you. We also have a few concentric circles that are leading the eyes deeper within the image, and you can see them here, getting smaller and smaller, kind of leading you deep towards that smaller circle. Understanding how movement can be manipulated in an image can be very useful to the artist, okay, and they can take advantage of it, especially if there is something in particular the artist wishes people to look at. So, in this image, our focal point is the red house, and the principle of movement is emphasizing that by repeatedly leading our gaze towards that house. So for starters, we have a trail of bushes leading from the lower left towards the house, okay? Secondly, we have a tree line in the background. And even though it's curved, okay, it still leads right towards the red house. And finally, we have the implied lines created by the two larger trees that make yet another visual pathway towards that red house. Even if the red house was not, contrasting everything else by having geometric shapes make up it up versus organic shapes, or it wasn't emphasized by it being red versus being green like everything else, we would still have our gaze led there based on these visual pathways that are created. Here we have a Japanese woodblock print by Hokusai. He is a Japanese artist that lived during the Edo period. He lived in about present-day Tokyo area, and he created this work in 1829 to 1833. Now, this is a Japanese woodblock. So imagine like a stamp, a very fancy stamp where you're able to carve a design, add ink, and stamp it on a piece of paper, add more ink, stamp it on another piece of paper, and do it over and over again. Okay. So This painting, okay, is actually not a painting, it's a wood block print, and it did not take 4 years to make. It's just that he made a whole bunch of them over 4 years. Now, these Japanese woodblock prints were able to be created very inexpensively because you did one design for dozens or even hundreds of the same type of print. People were also able to afford such items because they would cost about as much as a bowl of rice, which was fairly inexpensive for artwork. Okay, now we have some things that are being sold for $1.5 billion. No one can purchase that unless you're super rich. So this was really cool. The other thing I want you to take note of is the mountain that's in the background, okay? That is Mount Fuji, which had a very significant role in the cultural and religious traditions and beliefs in Japan at the time, which makes this also uh, part of the reason why Hokusai's work was very popular. People were able to connect to it, and he actually did a large series that featured Mount Fuji with, a couple dozen prints of different styles. So, how is movement being used in this work of art? Well, movement is leading us right to our focal point. And no, our focal point is not the wave. Despite the fact that most people call this painting, well, this print, the Great Wave off of Kanagawa, or even just the wave itself is not the focus. So you have this actual curved line of motion that swoops up from the base of the ocean, swirls around, and ends up towards the tentacle end of that wave. And the end of that wave is pointing where? To Mount Fuji. Okay, you have the boats that lead us up the wave, curves around down to Mount Fuji. You have the spray of the wave that looks kind of like snow falling on Mount Fuji. Mount Fuji is in fact the focal point, okay, despite the fact that it is not the darkest or the brightest or the biggest thing in the image. We have this motion that is created by the objects within this image to lead us to Mount Fuji. Now, your focal point doesn't have to be the first thing that you see. It's where your eyes end up after it, finds a start somewhere on the image. So, focal point, Mount Fuji, movement, nice swirl created by the wave. Now we have an oil painting by George Bellows created in 1909, and this depicts a boxing match at Starkey's. Okay, so if you take a look at this image, there's actually a lot of movement and stuff going on. Okay, it looks like the people there in the center that are fighting are actually thick at it. Okay, we not only have movement that's created by the figures themselves, okay, appendages of the two main figures and also the official leading us straight to the center of activity, which is those gentlemen's faces that almost combine into one because they're smashing into each other. You also have something called line of sight. Okay. And artists use this a lot to help remind you to look at the most important things. So if you take a look at some of the other figures within this painting, you have a few of them that are looking straight at the action just like you should be. Okay. Since it's the focal point. There is one outlier. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, there's a gentleman who's turned back and facing you. This is something that artists did a lot to help engage the viewer and make you feel like you're actually in that space, which is actually really cool. This is a Cubist work of art by Marcel Duchamp, created in 1912. Now, when I say cubism, I mean there's a lot of geometric shapes that are being used to form the figures rather than, having very meticulous line work and shading. Okay. So what we have is this work called Nude Descending a Staircase. And if you look kind of closely at it, can you kind of get the idea that someone's walking down a flight of stairs? I know it's kind of a big jumble mess of shapes and things like that, but we do have this downward motion based off of the angles that are zigzagging through it and the fact that the top of the figure gets lower and lower as it moves towards the right across the page. That is because Duchamp used the overlapping of images of someone walking down a flight of stairs to help create this work of art with the impression that these random rectangles and things like that are walking down a flight of stairs. So you have this downward motion based on how things are overlapped and the way that the top of the figure moves downward as it goes throughout the image. Now we have a work by Edward Degas, and this is a wonderful pastel work. Degas is very well known for his depictions of dancers, and he is known as an impressionist artist. So he did impressions. So fast works of art, trying to capture the moment. Okay, so like pre-photography, photography, but in pastel. And this specific work, we can obviously tell that that gal right there with the bright white dress, the red flowers in her hair and on her dress, she is the main focus. She is the debutante, okay? She is the one that we are going to be paying attention to, the prima ballerina. Now, the big question is, why do we look at her, okay? What ways is Degas using movement to lead us back towards that figure? Well, just as we saw in George Bellows' work, we have these lines of motion from parts of the figure, whether it's herself or the other ones in the room that are leading us upwards towards her face. Okay. We also, once again, have line of sight from some of the people in the room gazing towards her. Also, the one, if you look right behind her head, there's another girl who's looking towards her as well. So we have all these lines of sight and also the limbs that are leading straight to that prima ballerina. Very nice. Moving on. Okay. So we have this really cool artist that I want to share with you, especially because the way he did his work is actually fairly unique. So Hokuto Kunishi did he wanted to do a music video dancing. Okay, so just a music video. He took it one step further and took hundreds and hundreds of photographs of he and his partner dancing, cut out each of them individually, and then created a stop motion of it. Crazy. But I will be attaching in the description below a link to the behind the scenes, but also a link to the actual music video. So you definitely should check this out. It is super cool and a wonderful example of how we can create the illusion of movement, even though nothing in his image, the photos, they aren't actually moving. Very cool. So that's what I have for the principle of movement. I hope that this was helpful and hope you check out my other videos.